Hi, challengers. I am so sorry about the mix-up in times for last week. I will look forward to joining you this upcoming Sunday at 9 o'clock. So I prepared a different kind of lesson for you all than I've prepared in recent times. Normally, I talk something related to my work as the director of the Center for Religion and Public Life at Phillips, and there's, of course, always plenty on the front of how we religious people are showing up in public and all of our kin near and far who are just making everything continuously interesting. There's never any dearth of materials there. However, thought maybe I'd try something different. This is pretty much an old school Bible study lesson. I'm going to take a book that is maybe unfamiliar to most of you. It is, I'll say in a moment, a really unusual book in the New Testament. But it is a book that deals with a people frustrated because they feel like the goalposts have been moved, that the race they thought they were in was in fact a much longer race. As a former distance runner, I can't imagine coming to the end of a high school 3-mile race, sprinting into the chute and then being told, oh, you're only halfway there. When you think, I've got nothing left. How can I possibly go another 3 miles at that point? The pandemic, I know, has felt that way to a bunch of us. I'm sure that all of you who have children, who had small children at one point, remember that infernal travel question, are we there yet? And I think more than one adult has been asking that question in regard to the pandemic. Are we there yet? And we get continually frustrated when either the science says we're not there yet, or a public health official says we're not there yet, or we think we ought to be there by now. And if everybody had really cooperated with the science and masked and gotten their vaccines, we'd be there. And we wouldn't be still taking these pandemic precautions. So I'm going to ask you, how has the pandemic frustrated or complicated your life? That'd be a good question to ask yourself as we get into the book of To the Hebrews. How has the pandemic frustrated or complicated your life? In my own household, the issues have been relatively minor as compared to people who have lost a loved one due to the pandemic, over 100,000 children who have lost a primary caregiver in our nation, and all of the consequences that will accumulate and snowball for years because of that contingency. Right as the pandemic was shutting everything down in March of 2020, my dad died in the Chicago area. I could not make it back because of pandemic restrictions and our own family's need to stay local during that time. I could not make it back for a timely memorial service. And even when my family decided in the following summer, in the summer of 2020, to go ahead with the memorial service, because my mom, who has never stopped deeply grieving for a day, not a moment, after 70 plus years of marriage, my mom needed closure and they needed to do that memorial service. So I participated in the memorial service via a video and video contribution I made, and via Facebook for the live stream of the service. The pandemic disrupted my daughter Eliana's 8th grade school year, and with some lasting consequences from that. It has been very hard on kids and teachers, and um, let alone for healthcare professionals and the like. And I don't know how much we've heard in recent months now about burnout amongst healthcare workers, burnout amongst first responders, burnout amongst persons trying to hold down service jobs where there are just way too few people and the demands have not receded. We're still in a world of hurt regarding this thing. The goalposts have been moved. The finish line is still somewhere in advance. For you, how has the pandemic frustrated or complicated your life? And then a second question I want you to consider, and we'll have a chance to do this towards the outset of the lesson this upcoming Sunday. Can you name another time when you experienced in your own life the finish line being moved? What was that like? What was that like to have the finish line moved? That's really the question behind the pastoral question, the care question, the question of compassion behind the book of To the Hebrews. To the Hebrews, is going to be towards the end of your New Testament. If you had to memorize the books of the Bible as I once did, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, Peter's, John, Revelation. It's towards the end. It's toward the end. It's a weird book. It's also a fascinating book. It's weird in these kinds of ways. We have no idea, the scholarly world has no idea of where this community was, of when this community was, whether it was, in fact, written to a community very early, before the Roman sack of Jerusalem in CE 70, or whether it was 90 or 100 or whatever the time was. We don't know the time. And we have no idea who wrote it. We do know that this book has the format of a sermon, of an oral address. It's an exhortation of some sort, and in that way, quite different from any other book in the New Testament. Church theologians throughout time have loved it and not loved it. Martin Luther is one of its critics. You may remember that Luther referred to the book of James, the letter of James, as an epistle of straw, because he said it preached good works rather than grace. And he said, and I suspect that Hebrews may be stuffed with dung and straw too. This book is more concerned about angels than any other book in the New Testament, and not in a good way. So we will talk some about that. This book has a sacrificial theology that it names, again, different from anything else. In this book, this is the only book that says that Jesus was both the perfect high priest and the perfect sacrifice. Now, since we're dealing in more of a metaphorical world, you can have both things happening at the same time, but both perfect priest and perfect sacrifice. In chapter 7 of this book, it's towards the heart really of the book, there is a very strange chapter about a character briefly mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in the Abraham saga, a king called Melchizedek that Abraham met. And this is, he's a minor figure in the Abraham saga. But here in chapter 7 of Hebrews, Melchizedek is the one after whom Jesus is modeled. Well, we'll get into why that's so important. Here's why I think this is such an important book, a significant book, possibly for the kind of time we're in today. The audience for this book is both confused about who Jesus is and who they themselves are. They're having a real identity crisis as a people because of this delay in what they feel like the timeline is of where they should be. They are very worried about their own salvation. There was something they have turned from in order to turn towards being a Jesus community. But because of the goalposts being moved, because the time frame is now frustrating their expectations, they are considering going back to whatever that lifestyle was. In other words, they're considering leaving their Jesus community for something else. And the author of the sermon is 100% against that move of the people leaving. The sermon talks about, the preacher talks about how the people are being tempted to stop being there for each other. And he says that will be a fatal consequence if they turn away. The people the preacher is addressing have experienced some form of persecution, though he says not to the point of spilling blood, but their life has been difficult. The preacher also uses a combination of encouragement and threat to motivate them. He's trying to encourage them to be the people that they were called to be, and also threatening them with possibility of eternal damnation if they turn away from the Jesus community at the present time. Sometimes he refers to them in very kind and loving terms, and sometimes he calls them lazy and all but calls them stupid. Like all preachers do, not really, to their congregations at times. It's an interesting book. For your active imagination to get into this book, here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to imagine that you are Jewish, because we do believe the audience for this book was within Judaism. You are Jewish and you believe Jesus was the promised one of God. So you're Jewish who believes that Jesus is the promised one. You are not Christians. There aren't Christians really in the New Testament. There are Gentiles who believe that Jesus is the promised one of Judaism, and there are Jews who believe that Jesus is the promised one of Judaism. There aren't distinct Christian communities at this point. So you're Jewish, believe Jesus is the promised one. You also believe that Jerusalem is special, that Jerusalem is like a shadow of a city in heaven, and the temple in Jerusalem is a copy of sorts of a temple in heaven. They do have this three-decker universe going, right? Where heaven's above, the underworld of some sort is below, and earth is here. And there's this, as Joe Bessler will have told you numerous times about Platonism, there is an understanding that there in heaven, in the eternal realm, there are things that are perfect. And that here on earth, we have shadows, we have copies that are imperfect. Well, one of the things the author says is the perfect is coming, perfect is in heaven, and we are here to await it. And in your imagination, you are missing the comforts and rhythms of what it is you lost by leaving your old life and turning towards this Jesus community. You're missing those comforts. You're missing something old. Something has changed. You in fact have made a choice to change from your old life to the Jesus community life, but now you're really rethinking whether or not that was a good thing. When we get in this book, you're also going to see a fair amount about Moses and comparisons between Moses and Jesus, a fair amount about the trials the people had in the wilderness, that they were given a law, that there was a sinful rebellion, and that they came to the holy mountain, and where some shock and awe came from God, along with the new commandments. And there are then multiple levels of comparison between Moses and Jesus, and the scary mountain then, and coming before God, as the people have gathered wherever it is they gathered today, as they await something even far more powerful than what that was. And then we hear about a Jesus who is, again, different from any other of the New Testament books, where the people have to be convinced that Jesus and not angels are at the top of the feeding chain of the hierarchy in God's realm, and that Jesus was tempted just like we are tempted, but without sinning. So those are some of the things I want you to consider, have in mind as we consider this book. Really, the primary question I want you to have in mind is how has the pandemic changed your sense of timeline? Have you had an experience before of the timeline being pushed off? How'd you deal with that experience? So let me just read to you a few passages, very brief passages from the book of Hebrews, as I set up then what I'll do in class when we're together, where we're going to do, we'll ask some questions of each other. I will focus my attention on chapter 7 of this book, that talks about the extensive comparison between Jesus and this Melchizedek character. And then chapter 11, which many of you will recognize, this tremendous chapter on what faith is, and then the conclusion of the book. So the author starts out his sermon by saying, in the past, God spoke through the prophets to our ancestors in many times in many ways. In these final days, though, he has spoke through us through a son. God made his son the heir of everything and created the world through him, the son of the light of God's glory and the imprint of God's being. He maintains everything with his powerful message. Sounds in some ways like the beginning of John. After he carried out the cleansing of people from their sins, he sat down at the right side of the highest majesty. And so the Son became so much greater than the other messengers, such as angels, that he received a more important title than theirs. There are many commentators who think that some of these people have begun to believe that angels is what they ought to be worshiping. So they're a little confused as to who in fact they should worship at all. Chapter 2, he says, it's necessary for us to pay more attention to what we have heard, or else we may drift away from it. If the message that was spoken by angels is reliable, and every offense and act of disobedience received an appropriate consequence, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? Now, I want to say here that the way I read a book like this is not a understand it and go and do likewise. I read it as what was a people's encounter as their religious community is dealing with a difficult issue within their midst. How do they deal with that issue? What's their understanding of God that helps them deal with that issue? Well, we're getting that mostly through both the preacher's perspective as to what should be, as well as the preacher's perspective on what the people are doing wrong. So how the people responded to this, well, that'd be an interesting question. But again, I'm not saying, because the author comes down on the people like a ton of bricks in a particular place, that's what we ought to do today. I'm not saying that at all. This is an act of religious imagination. How do you understand who God is? How do you understand who your community is? And what do you understand as the relationship between God and that community when it comes to a particular issue, such as a frustrated timeline, delayed expectations. Very importantly, and this is chapter 2, verse 10, it was appropriate for God, for whom and through whom everything exists, to use experiences of suffering to make perfect the pioneer of salvation, which is Jesus. So you can get the therefore there, right? If God brought Jesus to perfection, to completion through suffering, well, maybe there is a purpose to suffering that the people are undergoing at the present time. All right, that's where I'm going to stop it here. This is a book that deals with the people suffering. This is a book that deals with the preacher who is arguing we have a high priest, we have a savior who has been tempted as we are tempted, but doesn't sin. A savior who is compassionate, who understands us. And so let's see what this book has to say when it comes to people of faith trying to remain faithful when the community is under stress and we feel like the goalposts have been moved. All right, so that's sort of an introduction to my lesson in Hebrews, and I really look forward to seeing you all in person 9 o'clock Sunday morning.